At the bottom of the Grand Canyon there is a hole in the ground that the Hopi say the human race climbed up out of. They have been saying it for 1,000 years, and they are still saying it. This is not metaphor. It is not the kind of soft language that comes apart the moment you press on it. It is a real place. Rock you could put your hand on, in a gorge you could walk into tomorrow. Tonight I'm going to show you roughly where it is, and why the people who know exactly where it is would rather you didn't come looking. But if you've heard anything at all about something buried under that canyon, this is probably not the story you've heard. The story you've heard came out of a newspaper. In the spring of 1909, readers across Arizona opened the Arizona Gazette to a front-page announcement that an explorer had found a lost city inside the Grand Canyon. Not some cliff dwelling on a ledge. A city, cut into solid rock, tucked behind a shelf of stone where nobody down on the river could ever have seen it. The main passage ran back hundreds of feet into the cliff. Off it were granaries, and the seed was still sitting in them. There were war weapons down there. Copper, with edges the paper swore were hard as steel. Mummies stacked in tiers on shelves, every last one of them male. And 100 feet in a hall of its own, a cross-legged idol with a lotus flower in each hand. The paper said the Smithsonian already had a team on the site, and it said the people who built the place had come from the east, possibly from Egypt. And then the whole thing evaporated. No photograph of it ever surfaced, and not one artifact from that cave has ever reached a museum. So let me tell you where I land on that right now, because I'm not going to walk you around for 2 hours and never say a straight word. That cave never existed. I think the historians have this one dead right, and I'll hand you the receipts as we go, including the name of the man who almost certainly invented it, and the nearly identical hoax he pulled 25 years before, which ought to be the end of the night, a fake cave, a dead story. Good night. Except for the one thing I have never been able to make sit down quietly. Centuries before that newspaper was printed, before Arizona was even a state, the Hopi were already describing an underground world beneath that exact canyon, a refuge where their ancestors sheltered while the world above them was destroyed, and the beings who took them in down there and taught them how to keep food alive in the dark have a name in the Hopi language, the Anusinom, the Ant People. Say that name out loud, slowly, on a channel called Anunnaki Dreams, and see if the back of your neck stays quiet, because mine doesn't. So the real question tonight was never whether some explorer found Egyptian mummies in a cliff. He didn't. The real question is quieter, and a great deal harder to wave away. How does a hack writer chasing newspaper sales in 1909, and an oral tradition carried by word of mouth for who knows how many centuries, end up pointing into the same canyon and insisting on the same impossible thing? That there is a world underneath this one, and that somebody was already down there. One of those two answers, by the end of tonight, you'll be able to explain to anybody who asks. The other one, I'll be straight with you, I can't. And when we reach it, I'm going to put it in your hands and let you decide for yourself. Chapter 1. Inside the Citadel. Let's start by walking into that cave the way the paper described it, because the details are far stranger and far more specific than most people who repeat this story ever bother to mention. The explorer's name was G.E. Kincaid. In the article he says he was making his way alone down the Colorado River in a small wooden boat on a trip that ran all the way from Green River, Wyoming down to Yuma. Somewhere in the eastern stretch of the canyon, in the Marble Canyon country, he says he noticed staining on the cliff face, high up, and went to look. And this is the first detail that snags on something in your mind. The article doesn't say the entrance was a few hundred feet up, it gives you a number, an oddly, almost suspiciously exact number. The entrance, Kincaid says, lies 1,486 feet down the sheer canyon wall, below the rim, tucked above a shelf so that you can't spot it from the river at all. 1,486, not about 1,500, not roughly a quarter mile down. A figure carried out to the exact foot. For a cave, he also insists no outsider will ever be permitted to enter on government land under penalty of trespass. And that combination is a classic move, precision that sounds like the careful record of a real surveyor, wrapped around a location no one else is allowed to go and measure. It cost a liar nothing to be exact about a place you can never check. Inside, the paper says, was a passage running back into the rock, about 12 feet wide at first, narrowing down to 9. Walls roughly 3.5 feet thick. doorways cut in clean oval shapes with round openings that looked like air vents. All of it, in the article's words, chiselled as straight as an engineer could have laid it out. And Kincaid says he went in. He mentioned seeing the chisel marks on the wall, and that's what made him curious enough to grab his rifle and keep going. More than 100 feet back, the passage is said to open into what the article calls the cross hall. And at the centre of it, a great seated figure, an idol, cross-legged, with what looked like a lotus or a lily carved into each hand. The face, the paper says, was not like anything in Native American art. It called the features Oriental, and compared the figure to depictions of the Buddha, and wondered aloud whether these people had some link to the ancient cultures of Tibet. The next room is worse. Off the main hall, the article describes a separate chamber, a crypt. The walls slant backward at an angle of about 35 degrees, and along those slanting walls run tiers of mummies, each one laid out on its own hewn shelf, arms folded across the chest, wrapped in a dark bark fabric, some of them coated over with a hard clay shell. And then comes the line that the hoaxer, whoever he was, slipped in to make your skin crawl. Every mummy they examined, he says, was male, no women, no children. The article even offers you a theory to chew on, that this must have been a barracks, a place for warriors, which is exactly the kind of small, needless detail a great liar adds, because a bad liar tells you what you want to hear. A good one tells you something you never thought to ask for, and the loose ends pile up from there, each one designed to feel like proof. Granaries, the paper says, still holding ancient seeds, copper cups, pieces of broken swords, copper tools so hard they were described as being like steel, and after all those centuries unrusted. A mysterious grey metal that nobody could identify, said to resemble platinum. Yellow stones scattered across the floor, the kind the article calls cat's eyes, each one engraved with a tiny human head. There was talk of hieroglyphics, untranslated, carved above the passageways and on tablets and urns. And a dining hall, the paper claimed, one long chamber it measured at about 40 feet wide and 700 feet from end to end. Kincaid said he took a number of relics and shipped them off to Washington. He said he'd taken some 700 photographs along the way, and he and the professor running the dig had a name for the whole underground complex. They called it the Citadel. If even one sentence of that were true, it would tear up everything we think we know about the story of the Americas. It would be hard proof that someone from the other side of the world, from Egypt or somewhere near it, crossed an entire ocean and built a fortress in the heart of Arizona thousands of years before Columbus was born. It would rewrite two histories at once, ours and Egypt's, and it would do it in a single stroke. The article even said as much, in a line that practically winks at you. It promised that Egypt and the Nile and Arizona and the Colorado would be linked by a chain of history running back to ages that stagger the wildest imagination. The reason so many people fell for it, then and now, comes down to tone. It doesn't read like a screaming tabloid. It reads like a careful man trying very hard to be accurate. Go back and look at the language, and you notice something clever. Kincaid himself, in his quoted words, almost never actually says Egyptian. He says a figure resembles the Buddha. He says the worship resembles that of Tibet. He hedges. He qualifies. He sounds like a cautious field researcher who doesn't want to overstate what he's found. It's the anonymous author of the article, the reporter who never signs his name, who takes all of Kincaid's careful maybes and welds them into ancient Egypt and King Ramses and a migration from the Orient. That gap between the witness who hedges and the writer who leaps is the fingerprint of a professional. The whole thing is built to sound like honesty. That's the craft. There's one more piece most people skip, and it matters. The famous article, the big one with the mummies and the citadel, ran on the 5th of April. But it wasn't the first. Nearly a month earlier, on the 12th of March, the same paper ran a shorter, quieter piece. A setup. It introduced Kincaid as a seasoned explorer just back from the river, mentioned some interesting archaeological discoveries in a low-key way, and planted the seed. Then it waited, and weeks later the big harvest came. That two-step, the modest tease followed by the blockbuster, is not how real discoveries reach the public. It's how a story is staged, which is a thread we're going to pull hard a little later when we go looking for the man who most likely staged it. Chapter 2. The Ant People. But before we put the newspaper on trial, I want you to look at who the Hopi say was already down there, in the dark, waiting, long before any explorer, real or invented, ever floated by. Because the Hopi didn't just describe an underground refuge, they named the ones who ran it, and it's the name that stops people cold. The Hopi call them the Anusinom, and for a channel with the name this one carries, I have to be honest, this is where it gets personal. The people who champion this connection break the words apart like this. Anu, they say, means ant. And Naki, they say, carries the sense of friends or people. So Anusinom lands as the ant people, and the related form they like to point to, Anunnaki, comes out as something like ant friends. Small beings, slender, humble-looking, but wise and generous almost to a fault. In the stories, they are the ones who take the ancestors underground when the surface world is coming apart, and they don't just hide them, they feed them. They share their own stores when the food runs low, and they teach them a skill that turns out to be the whole point of the lesson: how to keep food, how to store it, how to sprout beans in the dark so that people can survive without the sun. That lesson is not some dusty footnote. The Hopi still honour it. Every year, in the depths of winter, there is a ceremony the Hopi call Pawamu, the bean dance, in which beans are sprouted indoors, in the warmth, in the underground chambers, exactly the way the ant people are said to have taught. There are even old stories that explain, with a kind of gentle humour, why the ant has such a tiny waist today. Because once, long ago, the ant people pinched their own bellies and went hungry so that the humans in their care would have enough to eat. That's the flavour of these beings in Hopi memory. Not conquerors, not gods demanding worship, helpers who starved themselves a little so their guests could live. Now here is the part that makes people lean in. That name, Anu, the ant, the sky, the one above. Say it near the ancient languages of the old world and it starts to rhyme in ways that feel like they shouldn't. Because in the myths of Sumer and Babylon, at the very top of the heavens, sits a god named Anu, the Sky Father, the oldest of the old ones, and the beings who serve beneath him, the ones who are said in those ancient tablets to have come down from the sky to shape the fate of humankind, are called, in that tradition, the Anunnaki. Set the two side by side and try not to blink. On one continent, an ancient people speak of the Anunnaki, sky beings tied to the god Anu, who came down and involved themselves in human survival. On another continent, an ocean away, with no known contact between them, another ancient people speak of the Anunnaki, ant friends, beings who came, in their telling, from below rather than above, and who also came down into human survival at the hour of greatest need. Nearly the same word, nearly the same role, and it doesn't stop at that one word either. There's a second echo that the researchers who love this idea like to point to. The Hopi word for star is Sohu, and the ancient Egyptian word for the stars of Orion, that same belt of stars the Egyptians built their monuments to honour, is Sahu. Sohu and Sahu. Star and the stars. It's the kind of coincidence that, once you've heard it, is very hard to unhear. So on a channel called Anunnaki Dreams, you can imagine, this is not a thing I was ever going to be able to just walk past. But I promised you I'd be straight. And being straight means I have to slow this down and be fair, because this is exactly the kind of link that feels like proof and isn't. Linguists, the people who actually study how languages are built and how they're related, do not accept this connection. And they have a good reason, one worth understanding. Across the thousands upon thousands of unrelated languages that humans have spoken, words collide by pure chance all the time. Two peoples who never met, who share no history, will now and then land on similar sounds for completely different meanings. It happens so often that scholars gave it a name. They call them false cognates, words that look like cousins and aren't related at all. There is no established demonstrated link between the Hopi language and ancient Sumerian. None. Hopi belongs to a family of languages native to this continent. Sumerian stands almost alone in the ancient Near East. The odds of a chance overlap between two words in two such distant tongues are not as long as your gut tells you they are. So here's how I'd ask you to hold the Anunnaki and the Anunnaki, not as a proof, as a goosebump, real enough to make the hair stand up, honest enough that you know it might be nothing but the mind doing what the mind loves to do, which is find faces in the clouds and patterns in the noise. Hold it loosely, but go ahead and hold it. Because whether or not the name means anything, the tradition behind the name turns out to be far deeper, and far older, and far more specific than a single lucky rhyme. And that's where we go next. Chapter 3. The Four Worlds. To understand what the Hopi actually say is beneath that canyon, you have to step for a moment all the way out of the way we usually think about time. Most of us carry a straight line in our heads. The past behind us, the future ahead, one thing after another, and this present world the only world there's ever been. Hopi tradition doesn't work like that. It speaks in worlds, not countries, not eras exactly, but whole ages of creation that rise and fill with life and then fall and give way to the next. In this way of seeing, we are not living in the first world, we are living in the fourth. 3 worlds came before this one, and each of the first 3 in the telling ended in ruin. The first world has a name, Tokpila, and it is said to have ended in fire. Some who study these stories, and who like to look for the real catastrophe hiding inside the myth, wonder whether that fire remembers something true, a great volcanic upheaval maybe, an impact from the sky, a violent burst of the sun. We can't know, but the shape of the memory is fire and a world unmade by it. The second world is called Tokpa, and it is said to have ended in ice. Again the seekers wonder. The grip of an ice age, a shifting of the poles, a cold that swallowed the world. The shape of that memory is white and frozen and final. And the third world, Kuskudza, is said to have ended in water, in a flood, a rising of the seas and a drowning of the proud cities, until the old world was scrubbed away and only a remnant survived to carry on. Now, if a flood story at the end of an age gives you a certain feeling of familiarity, you are not imagining it. You are hearing an echo, because a great flood that ends a former world and spares only the worthy is one of the most widespread stories on the entire planet. It's in the Hebrew scriptures, in the story of Noah. It's older still in the Sumerian and Babylonian tablets, in the flood that the hero Gilgamesh hears about from the one man who survived it. It runs through the traditions of India. It surfaces in the oral histories of peoples all across the Americas and out into the islands of the Pacific. To some researchers, all these flood stories, scattered across the whole face of the earth, are the fractured memory of one real catastrophe, remembered 100 different ways by the scattered survivors. To more cautious minds, they simply reflect the plain fact that floods are the disaster nearly every early people, living by rivers and coasts, would have known and feared and woven into their sense of how a world can end. Either way, the Hopi flood at the close of the third world sits inside that vast worldwide chorus. It does not stand alone, and in the Hopi telling, at each of these endings, the same thing happens. The people who have kept faith, who have not forgotten the balance of things, are guided to safety. And the way they're guided is oddly precise. By day, they follow a strange moving cloud. By night, a moving star goes ahead of them. If that too rings a distant bell, it might be because a pillar of cloud by day and a fire by night is exactly how another ancient people, in another scripture entirely, described being led through the wilderness. The Hopi say this celestial guide led them to a sky being named Sotuknang, who acts on behalf of the Creator, called Taiwa in these accounts, and it was Sotuknang who brought them, at last, to the ant people. There's a detail in one version that I find almost unbearably vivid. Sotuknang leads the people to a great mound. He stamps on the roof of it and calls out and commands the ant people to open their home. And when the top of the ant hill is opened, he tells the people to go down inside, into the ant kiva, where they will be safe while the world above is destroyed. And he tells them, while you're down there, learn from these ants. Watch how they work, watch how they store, watch how they endure. It is a strange and beautiful piece of instruction. The gods, in this story, do not simply save humanity. They apprentice humanity to the ants. And notice what the ant people are, in this account, and what they are not. They are not monsters. They are not a superior race come to rule. They are workers, humble, industrious, self-sacrificing. In a tradition where the divine is imagined not as a distant king in the sky, but as something that comes up out of the ground, the great helpers of humankind are modelled on the most patient, most communal, most tirelessly cooperative creature the desert has to offer. That tells you something about the people who told the story. They didn't dream of power. They dreamed of endurance. There is one more layer here, and it's the layer that ties the whole tradition back down to the earth, to a specific patch of ground you could, in principle, stand near. Because the Hopi say that when the destruction had passed, when it was time to come up into this present world, the fourth world, they emerged, up through an opening. And the Hopi word for that opening is the Sipapu. every traditional Hopi kiva, every one of those round, half-sunken ceremonial chambers has a small hole deliberately set into its floor. That hole is a Sipapu. It is a model, a memory, a reenactment in miniature of the place where the ancestors climbed up out of the world below into the world of light. To this day, when the Hopi gather in the kiva, that little hole in the floor is the symbolic navel of emergence, the doorway between what was beneath and what is now. The whole architecture of their most sacred space is built around the memory of coming up from underground, and that raises the obvious question, the one that turns a beautiful myth into something with a fixed address. If the Sipapu in the kiva floor is a copy, then where is the original? Where exactly did the Hopi say they came up? Because it turns out they don't answer that with a shrug and a wave at the horizon. They answer it by pointing at a real place, in a real canyon. And it's a place you can actually find. Chapter 4, the Sipapuni. This is where the story stops being a legend on paper and becomes something you could very nearly reach out and touch. Because the Hopi place of emergence is not a metaphor floating in the sky. It has coordinates. Deep in the canyon, down where the little Colorado River winds toward its meeting with the main Colorado, there is a dome of rock. Not a building. A natural formation, built up over uncounted years by a mineral spring, layer on layer, the way a hot spring slowly cements the ground around it into stone. It's made of travertine, that pale yellowish rock that mineral water leaves behind, and it sits there in the gorge like a great blister of stone. You can find it on satellite images. People have. It's real, it's mapped, and it's right about where the two rivers come together, a little upstream on the Little Colorado from the confluence. That dome is the Sipapuni. For many of the Hopi clans, that specific mound of yellow rock is the place. The literal physical spot where the ancestors climbed up out of the third world into this one. And I want you to feel how unusual that is, because we tend to breeze past it. There are peoples all over the world with an origin story, a garden, a first place. But almost none of them can drive you to it. Ask where Eden was, and the best anyone can do is point vaguely at a region between some rivers and shrug. The Hopi don't shrug. They have an origin point you can put on a map, a homeland of the soul with a real location, sitting in a real canyon that you could photograph from a raft on the river. That is a rare and remarkable thing. A people whose creation did not happen in some unreachable elsewhere, but here, in this gorge, at this rock. And the water around it is part of why it looks like a place where a world might begin. When the Little Colorado isn't churning brown with runoff, it runs an unearthly, milky turquoise blue, coloured by all that dissolved mineral, the same mineral that built the dome. Blue springs feed it. The whole stretch has a quality of light and colour that does not feel ordinary, and you can understand, standing near it, how a people would look at that place and say, yes, this is the seam between worlds. This is where we came through. Now I have to slow down and be careful here, because this part matters more than any goosebump about a name. To the Hopi, the Sipapuni is not a tourist attraction. It is not a puzzle for outsiders to crack, or a set piece for a video like this one. It is sacred, in the fullest and most serious sense of that word. It is a living part of a living religion, and the Hopi have asked, plainly and repeatedly, that people not go tramping down there to gawk at it or disturb it. Around the turn of the millennium, the Hopi Cultural Preservation Office said as much, openly, about the sacred places in that canyon. And Hopi people who speak about it publicly today will tell you that to even properly approach that emergence point requires a spiritual preparation, an initiation, that most people, Hopi included, do not have. One Hopi guide put it about as clearly as it can be put. He said the emergence story is not just a tale about the distant past. It's a metaphor, he said, for how the Hopi people have developed and grown over generations, and it's also at the same time an actual sacred site that living people still care for and still protect. So we can do two things at once, and I think we're obligated to. We can find the parallel between this tradition and everything else in this story genuinely fascinating, and we can treat the tradition itself and the people who have kept it alive for longer than the United States has existed with the respect they are owed. Both. At the same time. That's not a compromise, that's just the honest way to stand here. And it's worth saying that the Hopi are not the only ones who look at that canyon and see the doorway to a world below. Their neighbours, the Zuni, tell their own emergent story, their own account of ancestors climbing up out of the earth after a time of catastrophe. They locate the arc of that migration in the same Great Canyon country. The main difference is a matter of counting. Where the Hopi say we are living in the fourth world, some Zuni traditions count it as the fifth. But the deep shape is the same. Up, out of the dark into the light after the old world ended, and it isn't only those two. That whole family of Pueblo peoples, along with others in the region, carries versions of the emergence, of ancestors who came up from below, sometimes protected there by ant people, sometimes by snake people, always brought through the worst of it and delivered into this one. This is not one strange story from one small tribe. It is a deep and widely shared way of understanding where people came from, held across many nations and anchored again and again to that canyon. So let me put the two things side by side, the way this whole video is built to do, and then let me immediately complicate it, because that's the honest move. On one side, a newspaper in 1909 describes hidden chambers deep inside the Grand Canyon, full of the dead and the strange. On the other side, a living people describe an underground refuge beneath that same canyon, and point to a real rock where their ancestors came up out of it, and have been pointing to it for who knows how many generations before that newspaper was ever printed. Two descriptions of a world beneath this one. Two sources that, on the face of it, have nothing to do with each other, and they seem, at a glance, to be aimed at the same place. Chapter 5. Who was actually in the canyon? But before we let that parallel run away with us, we have to do the thing most videos about this canyon absolutely refuse to do. We have to talk about who actually lived in that canyon. Not the invented Egyptians, not the beings from a myth. The real people. Because the true history of that place is not a blank waiting for a fantasy to fill it. It is crowded and specific and astonishing in its own right, and it has been sitting there in the archaeological record the whole time, quietly making the fake story unnecessary. Human beings have been in and around that canyon for something on the order of 12,000 years. The oldest traces are faint, just a scattering of stone spear points left by the very first hunters who came through when the last ice age was still letting go, back when animals we now think of as extinct, the mammoth, the giant ground sloth, still moved across that country. Those first people are ghosts in the record, known from a handful of chipped stones. But they were there. Then, roughly 4,000 years ago, we get something extraordinary. And it's the first real character in the true story of this canyon. Deep in certain caves, tucked into the almost unreachable band of rock called the Redwall Limestone, people began leaving small figures, little animal shapes, only a few inches long, each one made from a single twig of willow, or sometimes cottonwood, split down its length with a stone blade, and then folded and wrapped and twisted back on itself until it took the form of a deer or a bighorn sheep. Some of them have a tiny separate twig driven through the body, like a spear or a dart striking the animal, and that little detail changes how we read them. A spear through the effigy points away from a toy and towards something closer to a prayer. From that and from where they turn up, it's reasonable to infer they were made before the hunt, a small act of magic to ask the animal's spirit for permission, or for luck. We call the people who made them the desert archaic culture, hunters and gatherers who followed the game through that country. And these split twig figures, as they're known, are among the oldest human artifacts anywhere in the canyon. The first ones were found in the 1930s. Since then, hundreds of them have turned up. The detail that will matter later when we get to the so-called forbidden caves is where they turn up. Almost every one of them has been found in those Redwall caves, the single hardest layer in the entire canyon to reach, sheer walls with no handholds, caves so difficult to get into that a modern climber would need ropes and gear to do it. There's no sign anyone ever lived in those caves. People went up into those brutal, near-vertical places for one reason only, to leave something sacred in the dark under a small cairn of rock and then climb back out. 4,000 years ago. Real people doing something reverent and quietly staggering. And nobody had to invent a single Egyptian to make it remarkable. After the desert archaic came the people who learned to farm. The basket makers, named for their genuinely masterful weaving, who began to settle down to store corn, to dig pit houses and shelter in the rock. And out of that way of life grew the culture most people have heard of, even if under a name its descendants would rather retire, the ancestral Puebloans, long called the Anasazi. These were the builders. They raised stone granaries into cliff faces hundreds of feet above the river, tucked into alcoves to keep the seed corn dry and safe from rodents through the winter. They built villages on the rim and down inside the gorge, In the hot months they moved down into the canyon, and when winter came they climbed back up to the cooler plateaus, following the seasons up and down the rock like a slow tide. There are something like 2,000 known ancestral Puebloan sites inside the park's boundaries alone. 2,000. This was not an empty wilderness. It was a homeland, worked and lived in and loved. And they were not alone in that country. To the west lived a people archaeologist called the Kohonina. To the north and east related Puebloan groups, the Virgin and the Kayenta branches, each with their own pottery, their own style. Along the river and the western plateaus, the Patayan. For a stretch of centuries, roughly 1,000–1,200 years ago, the canyon and its rims held a whole quilt of cultures, trading, farming, building, praying, living. And then, in the late 1200s, a long and punishing drought settled over the whole southwest, years and years of too little rain, and the farming people gradually pulled up and moved on, drifting east and south toward better water, toward the Rio Grande and the mesas where their descendants live to this day. Because that's the other thing the true story insists on, the thing the fantasy always tries to erase. These people did not vanish into mystery. They have descendants, living ones. The Hopi trace their ancestry directly back to those ancestral Puebloan builders. So do the Pueblo peoples of New Mexico, the Zuni, the Havasupai, the Hualapai, the Paiute, the Navajo, the Yavapai Apache. Today, 11 native nations hold formal, recognized ties to that canyon. 11. They are not the faded remnant of some lost golden age. They are governments and communities and language programs and ceremonies still here, still connected to that gorge, still telling the stories their ancestors told. The Grand Canyon is not a haunted blank. It is somebody's ancestral home, and the somebody is still home. Keep all of that firmly in mind, because it's the ground we're standing on for the rest of this. The canyon does not need a fake Egyptian city to be extraordinary. Its real history is older, stranger, and more human than the hoax ever was. Which brings us, at last, to the hoax itself, and to the simple, brutal question that most of these stories are terrified to ask out loud. If there really was a lost city in that cliff, then where, in more than a century, is the proof? Chapter 6. The newspaper on trial. Let's put the newspaper on trial, and I want to be clear about something before we start. I am not going to protect this story just because it's a good one. A good story that isn't true is still not true. So let's follow the evidence and see where it drops us. Start with the coverage. A discovery like the one described, a lost civilization inside a national landmark, funded by the most respected scientific institution in the country, would have been the single biggest news story on the planet. Every major paper in America would have chased it. Reporters would have descended on Arizona. Scientists would have fought each other for a place on the next expedition. And what actually happened? One paper ran it. The Arizona Gazette. That's it. Not the New York papers, not the wire services carrying it coast to coast. One local paper in Phoenix and then a wall of silence from everyone else. When a bombshell that size makes a sound in exactly one room and no echo anywhere else, that tells you something about the size of the bomb. The sponsor is where it really falls apart. The article leans its entire credibility on the Smithsonian Institution. The Smithsonian, it says, is financing the expeditions. The Smithsonian's archaeologists made the finds. And the Smithsonian's answer when people started asking, which they have been doing for over a century now, is flat and total. They have no record of any of it. No expedition to that cave, no artifacts received, and no employee, ever, by the name of G. Kincaid, and none by the name of the professor said to be running the dig, S.A. Jordan. People have gone looking hard through the records. Those two men leave no trace anywhere. Not in the Smithsonian's files, not in the census in any way that fits, not in the historical record at all. They read, in the end, like exactly what they probably were. Characters. Names invented to hang a story on, attached to a real and famous institution to borrow its authority, the way a con man borrows a banker's suit. And then the loudest silence of all. In more than a century, not one photograph from that cave has ever surfaced. Not one artifact sits in any museum anywhere from that dig. No scientific report was ever published. No follow-up expedition ever went back. The Gazette never printed a correction and never printed a retraction. Not in 1909. Not in the years the same editor ran the paper afterward. Not since. Now, the believers seize on that last point. No retraction, they say. so maybe it was true and got buried, but think that through. Papers of that era ran tall tales constantly and almost never bothered to formally retract them, because everybody understood the game. The absence of a retraction isn't the shadow of a cover-up. It's the ordinary quiet of a story that everyone in the business already knew was a yarn. So the honest verdict, before we even name a suspect, is that the cave almost certainly never existed. There's no city. There are no Egyptian mummies stacked in a slanting crypt under Arizona. If you came here hoping I'd tell you the Smithsonian is hiding the bones of pharaohs under the desert, I'm not going to do that, because the evidence for it simply is not there. But a verdict of hoax isn't the end of a good story. It's the beginning of a better one. Because if somebody made this up, then somebody made this up. And that somebody, it turns out, may be one of the most gifted liars in the history of the United States. Chapter 7. The Greatest Liar in America. Let me introduce you to Joseph Mulhattan. In the 1870s and 80s, if a story appeared in an American newspaper that was too wild, too perfect, too gloriously strange to be true, there was a decent chance it had come from the pen of a travelling hardware salesman named Joe Mulhattan. He was born near Pittsburgh around 1853, and he made his actual living on the road, a travelling hardware salesman working for wholesale firms across the South and Southwest. But his real calling, his art, the thing that made him famous from coast to coast, was the manufacture of fake news. Long before the phrase existed, he would write up an outrageous story in the sober, careful style of a real report, sign it with a false name, and mail it off to a newspaper, knowing full well that most editors in that era cared far less about whether a story was true than about whether it would sell papers. And they sold papers. Oh, did they sell papers? The press gave him titles like a boxer. They called him the greatest liar in America, Munchausen Mulhattan, after the baron famous for impossible tales, the king of liars, the liar laureate of the world. He often signed his work with the pen name Orange Blossom. The New York Times, writing about him in 1891, said he was known in every city in the country and had probably caused more trouble in newspaper offices than any other man alive, that his wild stories, written in the most plausible style, had more than once sent serious correspondents racing across the country to investigate wonders that existed only in his imagination. And what wonders they were. Let me give you a sense of the man, because you cannot really judge the Grand Canyon cave until you've met its likely author. Mulhattan is the man who told America that the body of George Washington had been found petrified, turned to solid stone, and would be put on public display. People believed it. He'd floated a version of that earlier too, a plan to dig up Washington and Lincoln both and charge admission to view them for the centennial. He announced, through a Kentucky astronomer he invented, that the Star of Bethlehem had been located in the sky again after all these centuries. He reported the fall of the largest meteor ever known in Texas, and curious people from around the world actually wired the bewildered local postmaster, asking for details about an event that never happened. He announced the discovery, in Kentucky, of a lost pyramid packed with the golden treasures of an extinct race. He reported an invisible moon, 30,000 miles from the Earth, that somehow no one else could see. It gets better. He wrote that southern planters had begun training monkeys to pick their crops, and were planning to import them by the thousands, a tale so convincing that a real Kentucky farmer, who owned no monkeys and grew no hemp, was buried under angry letters from strangers demanding he stop. He described a magnetic cactus out in the Arizona desert and a devil tree down in Mexico. He invented a little girl at the seashore who tied a bundle of toy balloons around her waist and was carried off into the sky by a gust of wind, only saved when someone shot the balloons down one by one. He was so famous, so thoroughly woven into the culture, that in 1884 a convention of travelling salesmen jokingly nominated him for President of the United States. And here's the detail that tells you how completely he'd taken over the American imagination. Editors developed a reflex. When any story came across the wire that seemed a little too wonderful to be real, they would shrug and say, "Must be a Mulhattan." Now, hold that phrase in your head, "must be a Mulhattan," because you're going to hear it again in just a moment, and it's going to land like a hammer. Because here is the piece of this that turns Mulhattan from a colourful side character into the prime suspect. Back in the late 1870s, when Mulhattan first moved to Kentucky, he announced his arrival to the world the way he announced most things, with a lie. He wrote up the discovery of an enormous cave near a place called Glasgow Junction, A cave, he said, that had been explored for more than 20 miles underground, with 3 wide rivers running through it, and waiting in its depths, mummies. Ancient mummies, laid out in stone coffins, resembling the mummies of Egypt. A local businessman, the story went, was already building a steamboat to carry tourists along the underground river, and in a related tale at a Kentucky town called Litchfield, he described the finding of ancient Masonic emblems, buried for thousands of years, proof, he wrote, of a prehistoric race of masons. Now go back to the cave in the cliff. An underground complex hidden in the rock, rows of mummies, objects that look like they came from Egypt and the ancient old world, hieroglyphics and emblems that don't belong. Does it sound familiar? It should. Because Joseph Mulhattan built the exact template, the whole skeleton of the Grand Canyon story, roughly 25 years before that Arizona Gazette article ever ran. The hidden cave, the Egyptian-style mummies, the lost civilization that rewrites history. He'd done it all already in Kentucky as a party trick to introduce himself to a new state, and the people of 1909 saw it. That's the part I love. This is not some clever thing we figured out a century later with the benefit of hindsight. Within days of that big April article, another Arizona paper, the Coconino Sun up in Flagstaff took one look at the Grand Canyon story and in print waved it off. It said the whole thing looked like the work of some Mulhattanized individual. It even ran a little headline to that effect. Looks like a Mulhattan story. It pointed out with dry good humour that the writer had been clever enough to put the cave entrance high on a sheer wall where nobody but a person with a great imagination could ever reach it, and noted that nobody in that whole section of Arizona had heard a single word about any such discovery, which was strange indeed for a find supposedly of that magnitude. In other words, the neighbours called it fake the same month it was printed, and they knew exactly whose fingerprints they thought were on it. So I want to give you the honest, careful verdict, and I want to be precise about it, because precision is the whole difference between a debunk you can trust and a debunk that's just a different flavour of overreach. Did Joseph Mulhattan personally sit down and write the 1909 Grand Canyon article? That we cannot prove. The name got pinned to it afterward, by contemporaries and by later writers, most notably by a canyon historian named Don Lago, who traced this whole tangle in an essay a while back with a title borrowed straight from that old Flagstaff jab, Looks Like a Mulhattan Story. The attribution is a strong suspicion, not a signed confession. Mulhattan was aging and troubled by then, in and out of trouble, by some accounts struggling with drink after a bad fall from a streetcar that he claimed had scrambled his memory. He himself once said, in a line almost too good to be real, that he could not remember the first lie he ever told. So maybe it was him. Maybe it was some imitator working from his playbook. What we can say with real confidence is this. Whoever wrote that article was cutting from Mulhattan's cloth, using a pattern he had already made famous, in a country already primed to fall for exactly this kind of thing. The cave is his kind of lie, even if we can't prove the hand that held the pen. And there's a sad little coda to the man himself, one last uncertainty that feels almost too fitting. In 1913, a report went out that Joe Mulhattan had drowned in the Gila River in Arizona, swept off his feet crossing the swollen water while he was working a mining claim. Witnesses said they saw him go under. His body was said to be recovered and buried within hours. And yet, given who he was, given a lifetime of stories that turned out to be smoke, more than one writer since has wondered, only half joking, whether even his own death was one last Mulhattan. Whether the greatest liar in America hoaxed us right to the end. We'll never know. Which is, when you think about it, exactly the ending he would have written for himself. Chapter 8. The poison. Underneath the story. But there's a darker thread running under this hoax, and I don't think we get to skip it just because it's uncomfortable. Because the 1909 story wasn't only a bit of fun on a slow news week, it carried an idea inside it, a poisonous one, and that idea has a long ugly history in this country that most people have never been told. Look closely at what the Grand Canyon article is actually claiming. It isn't just that a cave has mummies in it, it's that a civilization from the old world, from Egypt, from the Orient, crossed an ocean and built something magnificent in America thousands of years ago. The article even nudges toward the notion that the local native people might be descended from those foreign visitors from Egyptian stock washed up in the desert, and that specific move, taking the achievements of Native America and handing them to some vanished race of foreigners is not a harmless flourish. It is one of the most destructive ideas in the entire history of American thought. It even has a name. Historians call it the myth of the mound builders. Here's how it worked. When settlers of European descent pushed across the Appalachians and into the Ohio and Mississippi valleys, they found enormous earthen mounds. Some conical, some geometric, some shaped like animals, some the size of small hills, clearly built by human hands with tremendous organisation and labour. And rather than accept the obvious, that the ancestors of the native peoples living right there had built them, a great many settlers reached for a different answer. They decided the mounds must be the work of a lost race, a superior race, a vanished white civilization they imagined, or Phoenicians, or Israelites, or Egyptians, or Welshmen, or refugees from Atlantis. Anyone at all, except the Native Americans standing in front of them. Leading men of the age argued over which lost race it had been. A future president floated his own theory. It became a favourite topic of lectures and parlour debates. And out of it grew, among other things, a whole strand of religious teaching, a story of ancient white peoples in the Americas that fed directly into the founding scriptures of a major American faith. And here is the part that turns a bad idea into a body count. If the native peoples had not built the mounds, if some noble lost race had built them and then been wiped out, then the story wrote itself. The native peoples must be latecomers, destroyers, the very sort of savages who had exterminated that glorious lost civilization. And if that were true, then pushing them off their land wasn't theft. It was justice. It was even, in a twisted way, revenge on behalf of the imaginary dead. That logic, the lost race and the guilty natives, was not a fringe fantasy. It reached the highest levels of American government. It was woven into the arguments for driving whole nations off their homelands. A myth about who built some earthen mounds became a rationale for ethnic cleansing. It took real science and real courage to kill it. And the man most responsible is a name we've already met tonight, which is a small irony worth savouring. Because the same John Wesley Powell who first ran the rapids of the Grand Canyon in a wooden boat in 1869, the one-armed Civil War veteran who lost most of an arm at the Battle of Shiloh and then went and conquered the most feared river in the West anyway, later became the head of the Smithsonian's Bureau of Ethnology. And under Powell, a scientist named Cyrus Thomas set out to settle the mound builder question for good. He surveyed, he excavated, he compared, and in an exhaustive report published in 1894 he demonstrated beyond serious argument what Thomas Jefferson had already suspected a century earlier when he carefully dug a mound on his own land. That the mounds were built by the ancestors of Native Americans. No lost white race, no Egyptians, no Phoenicians, just the brilliant, organised, deeply rooted peoples who had been there all along and whose descendants were still there, being told their own grandparents' work belonged to somebody else. So when that 1909 article hints that the canyon was built by wandering Egyptians, and that maybe the local tribes are their leftover descendants, it is not doing anything new. It is singing an old and vicious song. It is the mound builder myth in a new desert costume. And I think the right thing to do, the only honest thing, is to name it for what it is and set it down, not to amplify it, not to entertain it as an intriguing possibility, to recognise the pattern, understand the harm it did, and reject it. The Grand Canyon was not civilised by outsiders. Its real history is indigenous, from top to bottom, and that history is glorious enough on its own that it never needed a fake pharaoh to prop it up. And once you see that pattern, you start to notice something almost alive about this hoax. It doesn't die, it mutates. Left alone, a story like this just keeps growing new heads. Part of where it came from, before Mulhattan ever touched it, was fiction. In 1871, a wildly popular novel appeared, written by an English lord named Edward Bulwer Lytton. It was called The Coming Race, though it's better remembered today by the name of the mysterious energy at its centre, Vril. And its plot, in brief, is this. A traveller climbs down into a chasm and finds, deep underground, an advanced master race wielding a strange, all-powerful force. That book was everywhere. It sat in the imagination of the entire English-speaking world for decades. And you can feel its shape pressing up under both the Kentucky Cave and the Grand Canyon Cave, the underground civilization, the lost superior people, the buried power. Sometimes a hoax is just yesterday's bestseller, remembered as if it were news. And it kept going, straight through the 20th century and into our own time. Decades after 1909, the story got absorbed into the world of underground reptilian overlords and secret master races said to rule the world from below, grafted onto a mythology far stranger than anything Kincaid ever dreamed up. The story has been dressed up on cable television, presented as a real unsolved mystery on programs built to make the unexplained feel like the suppressed. It's been floated on the biggest podcast in the world as a fun what-if. Each retelling adds a little: armed guards protecting the site, tunnels sealed by the government, a cover-up that grows more elaborate with every version, precisely because there is no actual evidence to anchor it, and nothing anchors a conspiracy theory quite so firmly as the total absence of proof. A hoax with nothing solid underneath it is free to become anything, and this one has. Now, in fairness, and I always want to be fair, there is a version of the underlying question that isn't racist and isn't crazy, and I'd be cheating you if I didn't put it on the table, honestly. Set aside the specific 1909 lie. Could any people from the Old World have reached the Americas long before Columbus? That's a legitimate question, and the honest answer is yes, at least once, in one place. Norse sailors, the Vikings, reached the coast of Newfoundland around 1,000 years ago, and left the remains of a small settlement that archaeologists later dug up and confirmed. So transatlantic contact before Columbus is not impossible in principle. It happened, and people who want to believe in Egyptians in Arizona sometimes point to other tantalizing scraps. In the early 1990s, for instance, a scientist testing Egyptian mummies reported finding traces of substances like nicotine and cocaine, which come from plants native to the Americas, and for a moment that seemed to hint at some ancient contact across the ocean. But this is exactly where the discipline of being fair also means being rigorous. The Norse reached the nearest corner of the Americas, Newfoundland, by short island hops across the cold North Atlantic, and they left behind unmistakable physical proof: buildings, tools, metalwork, dated and confirmed. They did not sail up the Colorado River into the Arizona desert and carve a citadel, and there is not one shred of matching evidence that anyone did. As for the mummies and the strange chemical traces, the likeliest explanations turned out to be far more ordinary: contamination of the samples, or those substances entering the picture through much later handling, rather than ancient Egyptians running a shipping route to the New World for tobacco. The gap between what the evidence actually supports, a single confirmed Norse outpost on the far northeastern edge of the continent, and what the hoax needs, an Egyptian city deep inside the American Southwest, is not a small step. It's an ocean and a hemisphere, and nothing in that vast gap has ever been found. So we can grant the honest version of the question its due, and still see clearly that it comes nowhere near making the 1909 cave real. So that's the hoax, laid out as plainly as I can lay it. A fake cave, a fake explorer, a fake professor, a borrowed institution, a template built decades earlier by a master liar, a racist idea riding along inside it, and a century of mutations feeding on the fact that there's nothing solid to disprove because there was never anything solid to begin with. Case closed on the newspaper. Chapter 9. The Three Smoking Guns. Except the believers have never really leaned on the newspaper alone. They've always had three other cards to play. Three things in the real world, things you can actually go and check, that get waved around as the smoking guns, the physical proof that something is being hidden in that canyon, and I want to take all three seriously, because that's the only way to be fair to them. So let's walk right up to each one, and what you'll find, I think, is that every single one of them turns out to be true, and real, and checkable, and also completely innocent, and stranger and better than the conspiracy it's been drafted into. The first smoking gun is the one that seems, at first, genuinely hard to explain away, because it's right there on the map in plain sight and anybody can look it up. The Grand Canyon is full of Egyptian and Hindu names. It's true. Scattered across that canyon are great stone buttes and pinnacles with names like the Tower of Ra and the Tower of Set. There's an Isis temple, an Osiris temple, a Horus temple. There's a Cheops pyramid, named for the pharaoh who built the Great Pyramid at Giza, and then, right alongside the Egyptian ones, a whole pantheon from India and beyond. A Shiva temple, a Vishnu temple, a Brahma temple, a Buddha temple, a Manu temple, a shrine to Rama, temples to Zoroaster, to Confucius, to Apollo, to Thor. There's a Wotan's throne and a Walhalla plateau and even a King Arthur's castle. The believers look at this and say, come on. Egyptian gods, carved into the names of the very canyon where an Egyptian city was supposedly found? That can't be a coincidence. Somebody knew something. And here's the truth, which is so much better than the myth. Those names were not left there by Egyptians. They were handed out quite deliberately and quite recently by a homesick, well-read American geologist with a poet's imagination and a fondness for the mythologies of the world. His name was Clarence Dutton. Dutton was an army officer turned geologist, one of the great early scientific explorers of that canyon, working in the 1870s and 80s in the wake of Powell's expeditions. And Dutton faced a problem that anyone who has stood on that rim can understand. The canyon was so vast, so utterly beyond the scale of ordinary landscape, that plain descriptive language failed him. He complained, in so many words, about the poverty of English for a place like this. The usual vocabulary geologists borrowed from the Alps felt small and wrong, so Dutton did something wonderful. He looked at those towering, isolated buttes, with their tiered profiles and their flat crowns, and he decided they looked like the great temples and pagodas of Asia, like the sacred architecture of the East. And so, one by one, he began naming them after the gods and temples of the world's religions. He named Vishnu Temple around 1880, because he thought it looked like an oriental pagoda, the finest butte of the whole chasm. He named Shiva Temple around 1882, because he judged it the grandest and most majestic mass in the canyon, and named it for the Hindu destroyer of worlds. He was not recording an ancient truth. He was writing poetry onto the land. He was a 19th century man of letters, steeped in world mythology, deliberately turning the canyon into a kind of gathering place for all the gods of all the peoples, so that a visitor might wander from a Hindu temple to an Egyptian tower to a Norse throne, all in a single afternoon, all in the mind. Later surveyors caught the spirit and kept it going, men like George Wharton James and Francois Math and Henry Gannett, adding more temples and more gods until there were 23 of these named temples in all. And then, and this is the detail that quietly demolishes the whole theory, those names came first. Dutton and the surveyors who followed him were naming these buttes back in the 1880s, and by the time Kincaid supposedly floated down that river, the Egyptian and Hindu names had been sitting on the official maps of the canyon for something close to a quarter of a century. The hoaxer didn't reveal the canyon's secret Egyptian past. He read the poetic names off a map that a homesick geologist had dreamed up and spun a story around them. The names came first. The city came after. It's poetry, not archaeology. And the canyon's own foundation rock, the ancient dark stone at the very bottom of the gorge, still carries Dutton's touch to this day. Geologists call it the Vishnu schist, not because Hindus were there, because one 19th century American thought the deepest, oldest rock in the canyon deserved the name of a god. The second smoking gun is the feeling, endlessly repeated, that parts of that canyon are sealed off, untouched, forbidden, places no one is allowed to go as if something is being kept from us. And I have, honestly, one of my favourite stories in all of this to answer it with, because in 1937, a group of real scientists set out to reach one of the most sealed-off places in the entire canyon, and what they found on top of it is almost too perfect. The place was Shiva Temple. Remember, that's one of Dutton's buttes, a great flat-topped mesa that stands alone, cut off from the north rim by deep gorges on every side, its summit an island of forest floating high above the canyon floor. And a team from the American Museum of Natural History, led by a mammal expert named Dr. Harold Anthony, became convinced that Shiva Temple's summit had been marooned, cut off from the surrounding land for tens of thousands of years, ever since erosion severed it from the rim. And if that was so, they reasoned, then the animals stranded up there might have evolved in isolation, might be living relics, creatures that had gone their own way for 25,000 years or more. The newspapers ate it up. They called it the Lost World Expedition, borrowing the title straight from the famous adventure novel about a plateau where prehistoric creatures had survived, untouched by time. This was going to be a real life-lost world, a genuine island in the sky. They mounted a serious effort to get up there. It was a real climb. They even had supplies dropped in by parachute from a small plane, flown by a woman named Amy Andrews who put her aircraft at the expedition's service. Load after load of food and water floated down onto Shiva's summit, though one drop, a bundle including a dozen eggs, broke loose from its parachute and smashed itself to pieces on the rock. And the scientists reached the top, expecting to be the first human beings ever to set foot on that isolated island in the sky, expecting untouched wilderness. And here is what they found up there: ancient ruins, the remains of the ancestral Puebloans, the same canyon builders we talked about earlier, who had climbed up to that supposedly unreachable summit centuries before and left their mark. And better yet, they found an empty film box, dropped, it turned out, by a Grand Canyon photographer who had simply hiked up and gotten there first, ahead of the whole grand expedition. The untouched lost world, the sealed-off island no human had ever reached, had native footprints all over it, and a modern photographer's litter on top of that. There were no new species, no relics of the Ice Age. Just chipmunks and squirrels and rabbits, the ordinary animals of the North Rim, and the quiet evidence that the people who had lived in that canyon for thousands of years had, of course, already been there. That's the truth about the canyon's untouched forbidden corners. They are almost never untouched. Somebody was usually there first, and that somebody was usually indigenous. The third smoking gun is the most concrete of all, and I'll admit it's the one that feels the most suspicious until you know the answer. Because there are genuinely caves in that canyon that are gated shut, sealed behind heavy steel bars, off-limits, locked, protected. And when a believer hears that the government has literally welded a gate across a cave in the Grand Canyon, well, you can see how the imagination runs. What are they hiding behind the bars? Let me tell you about the most famous of them, a place called Stanton's Cave. First, the name, because even the name is a real story with real stakes. It's named for a man called Robert Brewster Stanton, who in 1889 was leading a survey expedition down the Colorado, scouting a route for a railroad along the river. It went horribly wrong. The leader who had bankrolled the trip and 2 other men drowned in the rapids. The survivors, shaken, abandoned the river, and before they climbed out, Stanton stashed some of their gear in a large cave up in the cliff. The cave has carried his name ever since. So the very name on that gate is a monument to a tragedy, to men who died on that brutal river, not to anything hidden or sinister. And what's behind the gate? What is the government so determined to protect? Bats. The gate is a bat gate, designed with narrow openings so the animals can fly freely in and out while people stay out. Stanton's Cave shelters a colony of bats, including a rare and sensitive species, and it once held an important maternity roost, until decades of curious visitors tramping through drove the colony away. The gate went up to give them their home back, and slowly they've returned. That's the secret behind the bars, not mummies, a bat nursery. But oh, the cave does hold a treasure, just not the one the hoax promised. Because Stanton's Cave is one of those redwall caves, and inside it, on the ledges and under the cairns, archaeologists found the split twig figurines. Dozens of them. Those little animal effigies of folded willow, 4,000 years old, some with the tiny spear driven through the deer or the sheep, left in the dark by the desert archaic hunters as an act of prayer. The first ones there were spotted back in the 1930s by river runners, and a serious excavation in the late 1960s, led by an archaeologist named Robert Euler, pulled out scores more, along with an astonishing record of the deep past. Driftwood carried into that cave by a flood some 40,000 years ago, when the river ran high enough to reach a cave that now sits well over 100 feet above the water. The bones of animals gone for 12,000 years, condors and mountain goats. Stanton's Cave is not a vault of forbidden Egyptian secrets. It is a genuine treasure house of the real, indigenous, deep human and natural history of that canyon, and it is protected and gated and off-limits for the most ordinary and honourable reasons in the world. To keep the bats safe, and to keep the 4,000-year-old prayers from being carried off by tourists. There's even a footnote here that the believers use as their final card, and it too dissolves under a moment's honest thought. In 1906, the United States passed a law called the Antiquities Act, which gave the federal government authority over ancient sites and finds on public land, and the power to protect them. And believers point at it and say, aha, there's the mechanism. That's how they suppress the discoveries. That's the legal cover for hiding what's in the caves. But turn it around. That same law is exactly why we know about the split twig figurines, and the granaries, and the 2,000 ancestral Puebloan sites, and the ruins on top of Shiva Temple. It's the reason those things were studied and preserved and published rather than looted and sold off piece by piece. The Antiquities Act doesn't hide the canyon's real history. It's a big part of the reason that history survived at all. The routine oversight that a conspiracy reads as suppression is, in plain daylight, just a country deciding its ancient places were worth protecting. So there they are, all three smoking guns, the Egyptian names which a homesick geologist wrote onto the map like poetry, the forbidden lost world, which turned out to have native ruins on its summit and a photographer's film box beside them, the gated caves, which guard bats and 4,000-year-old prayers, not pharaohs, every one of them real, every one of them checkable, and every one of them, once you actually check, more wonderful than the lie it was drafted into. That's the anatomy of nearly every cover-up story you'll ever hear. Take a real name, a real restriction, a real gap in the paperwork, ordinary and even beautiful things, and braid them together into a secret the facts never actually support. So strip all of it away. The hoax, the invented explorer, the Egyptian names, the lost world, the forbidden caves, pull every single one of those threads out and watch them all come loose in your hand. And when the smoke finally clears and everything explainable has been explained, there is exactly one thing left, standing in the middle of the floor. One thing I pulled at and could not make come loose. And it's time we looked at it directly. Chapter 10. The Long Walk. The one thing left standing is the memory, the Hopi memory. And I want to be precise about why it won't come loose. Because it isn't the name, and it isn't the goosebump. It's the timing. Everything we've debunked tonight, the cave, the Egyptian names, the Forbidden Zone, all of it is younger than that memory. The place names date to the 1880s, the hoax to 1909, the conspiracy theories to our own lifetimes. But the Hopi were describing an underground refuge beneath that canyon, and beings who sheltered them there, and a physical rock where they came up into the light, long before any newspaper, before Arizona was a state, before the United States existed at all, carried down the generations by voice and ceremony from a past we cannot even date. The hoax borrowed a canyon that already had a story living in it. So let's look hard at that older story and see just how deep its roots really run. Because the Hopi emergence isn't a single scene, a one-time climb out of a hole. It's the opening of an epic, and the rest of that epic is written, the Hopi say, across the whole face of the Southwest, in a form you can still go and see. After the ancestors came up into this fourth world, the story goes, they did not simply settle down at the nearest patch of ground. They were told to migrate, to walk out to the ends of the land in every direction, north, south, east and west, all the way to the edges of the continent and the sea, before eventually turning inward and finding their true and final home. And they went. The many clans of the Hopi, the Bear Clan, and the Snake Clan, and the Spider Clan, and all the rest, spread out across the land in a great slow spiral, each following its own path, each leaving behind, deliberately, a trail of what they made. Villages, camps, marks carved into stone, and when a clan moved on, the ruins it left were not just abandoned. They were, in the Hopi understanding, footprints, intentional markers, proof left on purpose that the Hopi had passed that way, that this land was witnessed and held by their ancestors. The Hopi word for it carries exactly that sense. Footprints. That one instruction reorganizes the entire map. It means that to our Hopi, the astonishing density of ancient ruins scattered across Arizona and New Mexico and Utah and Colorado, the cliff dwellings, the pueblos, the broken pottery, the rock art, all of it, is not a scatter of unrelated dead settlements. It's a single, connected record. The physical evidence of a migration that began at the emergence and wound across half a continent before coming home. Where a scientist sees separate archaeological cultures rising and falling, the Hopi see the chapters of one long walk. And both of those things can be looking at the very same wall of stone. That's not a contradiction. That's two peoples reading the same book in two different languages. And that reframing matters enormously for our story, because it explains something. It explains why the canyon is so central. If the emergence happened at the Sipapu, at that dome of yellow rock down where the rivers meet, then that canyon isn't just a place the Hopi have a legend about, it's the beginning of everything. The Doorway. Chapter 1. the navel of the whole world, from which all the footprints radiate outward. No wonder they guard it. No wonder they ask outsiders to leave it in peace. You do not treat the place your entire people came into being as a roadside curiosity. You treat it the way you'd treat the most sacred ground you have. Because that is exactly what it is. Now, the reason we're here, on this particular channel, asking this particular question, is a single word in tonight's title. Still. What the Hopi say is still buried beneath the canyon, and that word is doing real work, because the Hopi tradition does not speak of the underworld and the ant people purely in the past tense, as a thing that happened once and ended. In the tradition, the relationship never fully closed. The Hopi hold a body of prophecy, teachings about the shape of the world and the signs of its turning, that many Hopi consider deeply sacred and are cautious about sharing. And woven through that prophecy is the idea that this fourth world, too, is not permanent. That it, like the three worlds before it, moves toward a great transition, a purification, an ending and a new beginning, the emergence into a fifth world. And in some tellings of that prophecy, the ant people are not simply a memory from 2 catastrophes ago. They are watchers, still present, still beneath, and destined to return when the world is once again in peril, to shelter the faithful the way they did before, not as conquerors, as they always were, as helpers who come up out of the deep places when they're needed. I want to be careful and respectful about how I hold that, the same way I've tried to be careful all night. That is sacred prophecy belonging to a living people. It is not mine to interpret, or to turn into a prediction, or to use to scare anyone. I'm telling you it exists and roughly what it says because it bears directly on our question. When we ask what the Hopi say is still down there, the honest answer is that in their tradition, the doorway was never bricked shut. The underworld and its inhabitants are part of an ongoing story, not a finished one. Whatever you make of that, and reasonable people make very different things of it, it is a real feature of a real and enduring faith. And there is more inside the tradition than most retellings, including the tamer ones, ever mention. The old Hopi accounts, as they were recorded in the 20th century by writers who worked with Hopi elders, contain details that stop you when you read them. They speak of the destruction of an earlier world in which people had flown. In craft, the accounts call flying shields, patuvota, that rose into the air, and of a corruption and warfare that brought that world down, until the sky god washed even those flying shields to the bottom of the sea, along with the proud cities. Now, some modern readers seize on that and shout that the Hopi were remembering ancient aircraft, or visitors from the stars. And I have to separate 2 things cleanly here, because they are not the same. That the tradition contains the image of flying shields in a destroyed former world that is a genuine and recorded part of the oral literature. What those images meant to the people who told them, whether they are symbol or vision, or the memory of something real, that is interpretation, and the leap to ancient astronauts is a modern claim laid on top of the tradition from the outside, not a conclusion the tradition itself hands you. I'll give you the image, because it's really there and it's extraordinary. I won't tell you it proves flying machines, because it doesn't, and the people it belongs to did not tell it to prove that. Keep the image. Be honest about the leap. That's the whole discipline of a story like this. Chapter 11. What the Anunnaki actually were. And since we keep circling back to that other name, the one this channel is built around, I think we owe it a proper look too. Not a lazy one. Because the Anunnaki, the real ones, the ones in the actual ancient tablets, are worth understanding on their own terms before anybody welds them to a canyon in Arizona. In the mythology of ancient Sumer and Babylon, the oldest written religion we know of, the Anunnaki were a group of gods, the offspring and court of the great sky father Anu. Their name, in the scholarly reading of the Sumerian, means something close to those of royal blood, or the offspring of Anu, the princely gods. In the myths, they do the work of the divine world, they set destinies, they judge. In one famous story they sit in dread while a great flood rages, the very flood the hero Gilgamesh later hears about. They are, in short, the high gods of a real and sophisticated civilization, the people who gave us the first writing, the first cities, the first written laws, the wheel as we'd recognize it, and the division of the hour into 60 minutes that you still live by every day. That much is solid history and genuine mythology, and it is astonishing enough without a single embellishment. But that is almost never what people mean today when they say Anunnaki. What they usually mean comes from a modern author named Zecharia Sitchin, who beginning in the 1970s published a series of enormously popular books arguing something far stranger. Sitchin claimed that the Anunnaki were not gods at all, but flesh and blood extraterrestrials, visitors from a hidden planet he called Nibiru, on a long and eccentric orbit that brings it back to us every few thousand years. He claimed they came to Earth to mine gold, that they grew tired of the labour, and that they genetically engineered early humans, spliced our ancestors together to be a slave race to work the mines. In his telling, the whole story of the ancient Near East and half the myths of the world is really a garbled record of alien genetic engineers managing their human livestock. It is a sweeping, cinematic, weirdly compelling story, and it is the direct root of most of what floats around under the word Anunnaki online today. Here is where I have to do the thing I've done all night and hold two feelings at once. I find Sitchin's vision genuinely fascinating as a piece of modern myth-making, and I have to tell you honestly that the scholars who actually read Sumerian, the people who have spent their lives with these tablets, do not accept his translations or his conclusions, and they are not shy about why. They say, flatly, that Sitchin mistranslated key words, that Nibiru in the actual text is associated with a known celestial body, and not a hidden homeworld of aliens, that the genetic engineering story is read into the myths rather than out of them, that again and again he took a word or an image and stretched it to mean something the language simply does not support. Sitchin was a gifted and sincere writer, but he was not trained in the language, and specialists regard his work as imaginative fiction dressed in the costume of scholarship. That is not me sneering. That is the settled view of the field that owns the texts. So why does it matter here? Because the whole emotional charge of tonight, the reason the Anunnaki and the Anunnaki rhyming makes the hair stand up, runs partly on Sitchin's version, the alien engineers, the visitors from the sky who shaped humankind. And if you're going to hold the goosebump honestly, you have to know that the ancient astronaut layer sitting under it is a modern invention, not an ancient fact. The genuine article, the real Sumerian Anunnaki, are high gods in a beautiful and complex mythology. The ant people are benevolent underground helpers in a beautiful and complex mythology. Both traditions are real. Both are worth deep respect. And the thing that supposedly binds them into one, the resurrected alien race from Nibiru, is a story from the 1970s, not from the ancient world. You can still find the rhyme uncanny. I do. Just know exactly which parts are ancient and which parts are ours, and it's worth noticing that the impulse itself, the pull toward beings who live below and come up to help or to rule, is not unique to Sumer or the Hopi. It is nearly everywhere. All across the world, human beings have told stories of powerful entities inside the earth. The Pueblo peoples speak in various traditions not only of ant people, but of snake people beneath the surface. Cultures across Europe filled their underground with dwarves and gnomes, and hidden folk who worked metal and guarded treasure in the deep places. Tales of subterranean kingdoms, of hollow spaces beneath mountains where something ancient waits, turn up on nearly every continent. Now, a believer looks at that global spread and says, they can't all be making it up. There must be a real memory underneath it. And a skeptic looks at the exact same spread and says, of course it's everywhere. The underground is the universal human symbol for the hidden, the ancestral, the dead, the source, the place we bury our people and imagine our origins, and every culture that ever dug a grave or sheltered in a cave was going to populate the dark below with meaning. Both of those readings are looking at the same worldwide pattern, and I genuinely cannot tell you which one is right. What I can tell you is that the Hopi version is not some lonely oddity. It sits inside one of the oldest and most universal habits of the human imagination, which makes it, depending entirely on your temperament, either much easier to explain or much harder to dismiss. Chapter 12. Into the Great Unknown. I keep coming back to one idea, and I want to say it plainly, because it's the beating heart of why the hoax bothers me so much. The real history of that canyon is a better story than the fake one. It's more dangerous, more human, and more astonishing. And nobody had to invent a thing. Take the man who first proved you could even travel through that gorge and live. His name, again, is John Wesley Powell, and I mentioned him earlier as the scientist who helped destroy the racist mound builder myth. But before any of that, he was something simpler. He was the first to run the Grand Canyon and come out the other side, and how he did it should be on the screen instead of a fake Egyptian mummy. Powell was a one-armed Civil War veteran. He'd lost most of his right arm to a Confederate musket ball at the Battle of Shiloh in 1862, the wound aching him for the rest of his life. And in the spring of 1869, at 35 years old, with no government backing worth mentioning, because Congress figured the land was worthless and the river was suicide, he gathered 9 other men, 4 wooden boats built for calm harbour water, and around 10 months of food, and pushed off from Green River Station in Wyoming into a blank space on the map. Nobody knew what was down there. Not the map makers, not the settlers, not, in any detailed way, even the native peoples of the region. It was, in the truest sense, unknown, and the river did its best to kill them. Barely 2 weeks in, one of the boats, the No Name, missed a signal and shattered on the rocks at a place they named Disaster Falls, taking with it about a third of their food and, worse, most of their barometers, the only instruments Powell had to measure altitude and make his maps. The heat cooked them. The rain rotted their bacon and soured their flour. One man quit early, walking off at a reservation to take his chances on solid ground. The others pressed on into deeper and darker rock, running rapids no human being had ever named, in boats that leaked and flipped and filled, hauling those boats around falls too violent to run, on stomachs that grew emptier by the day. Powell himself, one-armed, nearly died on a cliff face, and was saved only when a crewman stripped off his own trousers and lowered them down like a rope. On the 13th of August, they reached a place Powell called the foot of the Grand Canyon, where the Little Colorado pours into the main river. That confluence. The same stretch of canyon where the Hopi say their ancestors emerged into this world, where the Sipapu sits in the gorge. And standing at that exact meeting of waters, Powell wrote one of the most famous lines in the history of American exploration. He wrote that they were now ready to start down the great unknown. He did not know the Hopi already had a name for what lay in that country. He only knew he was rowing into the dark. The worst was still ahead. Deep in the canyon, near the lower end, they came to a rapid so terrible that 3 of the men could not face it. On the 28th of August, after 99 days and nearly 1,000 miles of that punishment, the 2 Howland brothers and a man named William Dunn decided they would rather take their chances climbing out and walking across the desert than run one more rapid. Powell begged them to stay. They wouldn't. He offered them guns and a share of the miserable food. They took the guns, and the party split in 2 at a place they named, forever, Separation Rapid. The men in the boats ran the water that had terrified everyone and survived, and reached safety 2 days later, gaunt and half-naked and barely alive. The 3 who climbed out were never seen alive again. Most likely they were killed on the plateau above, in a tragic case of mistaken identity, taken for other men who had done a terrible thing. Nobody knows for certain to this day. Their fate is a real mystery, an unsolved one, hanging over a real canyon. And it is far heavier and far truer than any invented crypt of warriors. That is the story that actually happened up there. A one-armed man and a handful of half-starved companions in leaking wooden boats, rowing into a gorge no one had mapped, some of them dying for it. And the cruel little irony, the one that ties this whole night together, is that the conspiracy crowd sometimes drags Powell's name into their theories, casting the man and the bureau he later led as part of the cover-up, the very institution supposedly hiding the Egyptian truth, when in reality Powell is the reason the canyon was mapped and studied at all, and his bureau is what finally proved, with patient science, that Native Americans built their own monuments and needed no lost white race to do it for them. They took the one man who actually risked his life in that canyon, and the one institution that actually defended indigenous history, and cast them as the villains. That's how these stories work. They don't just invent a fake past, they slander the real one. And here's the last honest twist, the one that keeps me from tying this off too neatly, the one that lets a little air back into the mystery after all that debunking. Because for all that we know about that canyon, for all the mapping and surveying and a century and a half of river runners, it is still, genuinely, not fully explored. The canyon is built in layers, and one of those layers is a thick band of pale stone called the Redwall limestone. And limestone, when mildly acidic water works on it over ages, dissolves. It hollows out. It forms caves. The red wall of the Grand Canyon is honeycombed with them, cave after cave after cave opening in the sheer cliffs high above the river, most of them impossible to reach without ropes and climbing gear, many of them never entered by a modern human being at all. This is not speculation. It's plain geology. There are, Right now, caves in that canyon that no one living has ever set foot inside. That's simply true. And remember what was found in the Redwall caves that people did manage to reach. The split-twig figurines, the 4,000-year-old prayers, left in the dark by hunters who somehow climbed into places that stop modern climbers cold. Remember what was found on top of Shiva Temple, the sealed-off island in the sky that no one was supposed to have reached. Ancestral Puebloan ruins. The plain, repeated, humbling lesson of that canyon is that human beings got into its most impossible corners long, long before we assumed anyone could. Over and over, we've walked into a place certain that we were the first, and found, waiting for us in the dust, the quiet proof that the ancestors of the people who still live there got there first. So when someone says there might be undiscovered chambers in the Grand Canyon, they're not wrong. There almost certainly are. The mistake is only in imagining that what's inside them is Egyptian. Chapter 13. 3 ways to explain it. So let's do the hard thing now. Let's take that last standing mystery, the parallel between the hoax and the Hopi memory, and instead of just marvelling at it, let's actually try to explain it away. Because if it can be explained, an honest person is obligated to try. And there are really only a few possibilities on the table. The first possibility is the simplest, pure coincidence. The canyon is, after all, the most dramatic hole in the ground on the continent, a mile deep and hundreds of miles long, a place that overwhelms everyone who stands at its edge. If you were a 19th century hoaxer sitting down to invent a lost underground civilization anywhere in America, where else would you set it? You'd set it in the most awe-inspiring, most cavernous ground available, and that happens to be the same ground a nearby people had built their own underground origin story around. For the same underlying reason, because it is a staggering place full of literal caves that naturally makes the human mind think of worlds beneath worlds. On this reading, the hoaxer and the Hopi arrived at the same canyon independently, not because they were describing the same real thing, but because the canyon itself pulls that kind of story toward it, the way a magnet pulls iron. 2 arrows landing near each other because they were both aimed at the biggest target in the room. That's a genuinely strong explanation, and I won't pretend it isn't. The second possibility is more interesting, and it's the one I actually find most persuasive: transmission. The idea that the person who wrote that 1909 article had heard, somewhere in some garbled second-hand form, a version of the Hopi or the Havasupai or the Zuni emergence tradition, and that he took that real native story of an underground world beneath the canyon, stripped it of its meaning, dressed it up in Egyptian costume to make it sell, and passed it off as a discovery. Think about how possible that is. By 1909, the Southwest was full of writers, railroad promoters, tourist operators, and amateur enthusiasts hungry for exactly this kind of local colour. Native emergent stories were being written down and discussed. A clever storyteller looking for raw material would not have had to look far to hear that the local tribe spoke of coming up out of a world below, right here in this canyon. And a story like that, in the hands of someone chasing a headline, practically converts itself into a lost cave of ancient foreigners. On this reading, the parallel isn't a coincidence at all. It's a theft. The hoax and the Hopi tradition point at the same canyon because the hoax quietly copied the tradition and filed off the serial numbers. That, honestly, is my best guess. It's the explanation I'd put my money on. But I have to be fair to a third possibility, even though it's the one my rational mind resists, because being fair to the uncomfortable option is the whole reason you're still here. And the third possibility is simply that the Hopi are describing something real. Not Egyptians, not aliens, but a genuine, ancient, human memory of sheltering underground, in caves, in that canyon, through some catastrophe in the deep past, carried forward with astonishing fidelity by a people who never wrote it down but never let it go. We know human beings were in that canyon 12,000 years ago. We know they climbed into impossible caves. We know the last ice age ended in that window with real floods, real upheaval, real worlds ending for the people who lived through them. Is it truly unthinkable that a tradition of underground refuge in that canyon preserves, at its core, the echo of something that actually happened to real ancestors in a real crisis, remembered in the language of ant people and emergence because that was the language they had? I can't prove it. I can't even really argue for it. But I also can't stand here and swear to you it's impossible. And that small inability, that one honest crack in my certainty, is the thing I could not seal shut no matter how hard I pushed. Here's what I keep landing on. Every explanation on that list requires you to accept something remarkable. Coincidence asks you to accept that two unrelated sources aimed at the same canyon and hit the same impossible idea. Transmission asks you to accept that a headline-chasing liar unknowingly preserved and transmitted a fragment of sacred indigenous tradition, that the fake story is, buried inside it, an accidental fossil of the real one. And the third option asks you to accept that an oral memory could carry the shape of a real event across a span of time that makes your mind go blank to contemplate. There is no boring answer here. Every road out of this leads somewhere strange. You only get to choose which strangeness you find easiest to live with. Chapter 14. The town at the bottom of the canyon. One fact ought to make the whole hoax collapse under its own weight. While a century of treasure hunters have chased a dead foreign city that never existed in that canyon, there has been, the entire time, a living town at the bottom of it. Real people in real houses with a school and a church and a cafe and a post office, tucked into a side gorge of the Grand Canyon right now, as you watch this. It's called Supai, and it's the home of the Havasupai, whose name means the people of the blue-green water. They have lived in that canyon for something like 800 to 1,000 years, farming corn and squash and beans along a creek that runs an unreal turquoise coloured like the Hopi Sipapu by the mineral travertine in the water, and Supai is, by a good measure, the most remote community in the lower 48 states. There is no road to it. None. To get there you hike or ride 8 miles down a trail or you come in by helicopter. And here's the detail that tells you just how far outside the modern world it sits. Supai is the only place left in the entire United States where the mail is still delivered by mule. A train of mules loaded with canvas mailbags walks the letters and the groceries down into the canyon, day after day, the way it has since the 1930s. Every parcel that comes out carries a special postmark. Mule train mail. Sit with the size of the irony there for just a second. Around 5 million people visit the Grand Canyon every single year, stand at the rim, snap their photos, and drive away. And the overwhelming majority of them never learn that there is a Native American town living down in the folds of it, a community that has been there since before the Pilgrims landed. The real hidden civilization of the Grand Canyon was never Egyptian, and it was never a secret anyone had to dig for. It's down there right now, getting its mail by mule, and almost nobody looks, and if you want a real story the government tried to bury at the Grand Canyon, here it is, and it has nothing to do with a cave. It's the story of what was done to the Havasupai themselves. For as far back as anyone can trace, the Havasupai didn't only live at the bottom of the canyon by that turquoise creek. They lived a double life, tuned to the seasons. In the warm months they farmed the canyon floor. In the cold months they climbed up onto the plateau above the rim, out into the pine forests and grasslands near what's now the South Rim, to hunt deer and gather and let the land below rest. Their true homeland was enormous, something on the order of 1.5 million acres of canyon and plateau that they had used and known and cared for centuries. Then, in 1882, the United States government drew a line around them. President Chester Arthur signed an executive order that penned the entire Havasupai people into a single strip of land at the bottom of the canyon. 518 acres. That was the whole of it. A people whose homeland had spanned 1.5 million acres were told, by the stroke of a pen they never signed, that they now held barely more than a farm's worth of ground at the bottom of a hole. By their own account, they didn't even learn of the order for years. The plateau where they'd wintered for generations became public land, and when the Grand Canyon became a national park in 1919, its boundaries closed in around what little was left. Park officials wanted them gone. Over the decades that followed, families were pushed off the land, and in some cases their homes and their crops were burned so there would be nothing to come back to. The most quietly heartbreaking case sits about halfway down the Bright Angel Trail, at a green farming oasis the Havasupai call Ha'agio, a man the park employees nicknamed Billy Burrow because he could climb the canyon walls like a mule, farmed there with his family for generations. In 1928, the Park Service forced the last of them out, took the oasis, and renamed it, with a casual cruelty that stuck for almost a century, Indian Garden. Only in 2022 was that name finally corrected to Havasupai Gardens. Roughly 100,000 hikers pass through that spot every year on their way down into the canyon. Almost none of them are ever told whose garden it was, and what actually happened there is the exact opposite of the conspiracy story. There was no secret buried in a cave. The thing being erased, if you want to call it that, sat in plain daylight and it was a people being quietly pushed off the rim of their own canyon so the rest of the country could enjoy the view. The real vanishing act at the Grand Canyon wasn't archaeological, it was human and legal and recent. The Havasupai did not accept it, and their refusal belongs in a documentary far more than any invented crypt of warriors does. For the better part of a century they fought. They petitioned and testified, and sent their leaders to Washington to argue, in a language and a legal system built to shut them out, that the land they had wintered on for hundreds of years should be returned to them. It took decades. It took generation after generation refusing to let the claim die. And in 1975, after a struggle that had ground on for roughly 90 years, Congress finally passed a bill that President Gerald Ford signed into law, giving back around 185,000 acres of that plateau to the Havasupai. It stands as one of the largest returns of land to a native nation in the modern history of the United States. Not a gift, a victory, wrung out of the government one stubborn decade at a time by a few hundred people living at the bottom of a canyon. That creek they farm beside is worth understanding too, because it runs on the same quiet chemistry that shaped the Hopi's sacred dome upstream. Havasu Creek flows an almost unreal blue-green, a colour that looks painted on, and it isn't dye, and it isn't a trick of the light, it's travertine. The water surface is loaded with dissolved limestone, and as it tumbles down the canyon it lays that mineral back down, building smooth stone terraces and turning the creek that vivid, milky turquoise. Farther down it spills over a run of waterfalls, Havasu Falls the most famous among them, a 100-foot ribbon of blue water dropping into a pool the colour of a gemstone, deep in a side canyon most Americans will never see with their own eyes. It is by wide agreement one of the most beautiful places on the continent, and it belongs right now, today, to the descendants of the people who were farming there before Columbus ever set sail. So when the conspiracy tells you the government has been covering up the true history of the Grand Canyon, there's a bitter little truth folded inside the lie. Something was taken. Someone was pushed aside. But it wasn't a vault of pharaohs and it wasn't a hall of records. It was a living people, and the proof of it isn't sealed in a Smithsonian basement. It's in the Federal Register, and the old court filings, and the memory of the Havasupai, who got their plateau back the hard way and are still down there farming beside the blue-green water. And it isn't as though the canyon's true story is being kept from anyone either. Quite the opposite. On the south rim, in a spot where 1 million tourists pass every year, stands the Desert View Watchtower. It was designed by the architect Mary Coulter and finished in 1932, built deliberately in the style of the ancient ancestral Puebloan towers, the real ones, the ones the real canyon people raised. And inside it, painted across the walls of the first floor, is a body of work by a Hopi artist named Fred Cabote. What did he paint? There on the rim of the Grand Canyon, for every passing stranger to see, the Hopi snake legend. The story of the first Hopi to travel down the Colorado River generations before Powell, carried on the water through the canyon and into the world of the snake people, and his return home with their sacred knowledge. It is the Hopi's own canyon story, rendered in paint, in the open, free for anyone to walk in and look at. The real story of that canyon isn't hidden behind a steel gate or buried under a government cover-up. It's on the wall of a tower on the rim, and it's carried in the mail by mule to a town at the bottom, and it's held in the memory of 11 living nations who never once stopped telling it. The people who came looking for a hidden truth walked right past the one that was standing in plain sight the whole time. Chapter 15. Still. So let's go back to where we started, all the way back to that spring morning in 1909, and finally answer the question this whole thing has been building toward. Because we opened with a question, and it wasn't the one most people ask. Most people ask, was the cave real? And we've answered that one thoroughly. No, almost certainly not. A fake explorer who left no trace in any record, a fake professor attached to a real institution that has spent a century saying it never heard of him, one newspaper that echoed nowhere else, and a template built a quarter-century earlier by the greatest liar America ever produced. The cave is a hoax. I told you that in the first 2 minutes, and everything since has only nailed it down harder. But that was never the real mystery. The real mystery was the other thing. It was the fact that the hoax was not the first voice to speak of a world beneath that canyon. It was the last. Centuries before that newspaper, before Arizona was a state, before the flag it flies under existed, The Hopi were already telling of an underground refuge in that exact gorge, of the small wise beings who sheltered their ancestors there through the ending of a former world, and of a real dome of yellow rock, down where two rivers meet, where the people came up into the light. They named those beings the Anusinum, in a phrase that rings, whether by chance or by something older, against the sky beings of ancient Sumer, and they have guarded that place and told that story for longer than anyone can measure. So here is the honest final shape of it, and I'm going to give it to you exactly as it sits in my own mind, no cleaner than that. Two completely separate sources, a headline chasing hoaxer with a pen full of lies, and an oral tradition carried by voice and ceremony across an unknowable depth of time, both pointed at the same canyon and both said the same impossible thing. There is a world beneath this one, and someone was already living in it. The hoaxer, I can explain. I can show you his method, his motive, his template, and the man his story sounds like. I've done exactly that tonight. But the memory that came first, the older voice, the one the hoax may have only been echoing, that one I cannot fully explain. Not entirely, and I've stopped pretending to myself that I can. My best guess, if you press me, and I'll give it to you straight because I've asked you to be honest right back, is that some writer in the early 1900s caught wind of the real native tradition of an underground world in that canyon and dressed it up in Egyptian clothes to sell papers, that the fake is a distorted photograph of the real, that the parallel is a theft, not a miracle. That's where the weight of the evidence points, and I try to follow the evidence, but I'd be lying to you if I said that guess closes the door all the way, because underneath it sits that other, quieter, older possibility, that the Hopi have simply been telling the truth all along, in the only language they had for it, and that the memory really is older than any of us guessed. I know which way the evidence leans. I also know exactly what that canyon has still never shown us, and I know those two things don't quite fit together, and I've made my peace with the fact that maybe they're not supposed to. So I'm not going to tell you what to believe. That was never the deal. I'm going to hand it to you the way I said I would at the start, but before I do, think for a moment about that word in the title. Still, what is still buried beneath the Grand Canyon? Because after all of this, after the hoax and the debunk and the long walk through everything that isn't down there, I think the honest answer to that question is not what anyone expected when they clicked. What's still buried under that canyon is not a city of the dead. It's something harder to loot and harder to fake, and in a way far more remarkable. There really are, right now, at this moment, caves in the Redwall Cliffs that no living person has entered. And inside some of them, almost certainly, more 4,000-year-old willow prayers waiting in the dark exactly where a hunter left them before the pyramids of Egypt were even built. That is literally, verifiably still buried down there. There really is a dome of yellow rock at the meeting of two rivers that a living people call the doorway their ancestors climbed through. A sacred place they still protect and still ask us to leave in peace. That is still down there too. And there is a tradition, older than the United States, deeper than any newspaper, that has outlasted every hoax told about that canyon, and will outlast this video too, held not in a vault, but in the memory of people who are still here. That's the real treasure. Not a thing you dig up, a thing that refuses to be forgotten. And maybe that's the quiet joke the whole story plays on the treasure hunters. They came looking for gold cups and Egyptian mummies and a secret the government was hiding, and the actual secret was never hidden at all. It was being told, out loud, in the open, the whole time, by the people who had lived there longest, to anyone humble enough to listen instead of dig. The hoaxer thought he was inventing a buried civilization. He was standing on a real one, with living descendants, and he couldn't see it, because he was too busy dressing it up as somebody else's. So no, I can't tell you there are pharaohs under Arizona, but I can tell you that the Grand Canyon is holding on to something after all. A first place, a doorway, a set of prayers no one has counted, and a name that a channel like this one was simply never going to be able to walk past. Whether the Anusinum and the Anunnaki are cousins or strangers, whether the memory is a garbled echo of a real newspaper theft or the true recollection of a real ancient dark, I've told you where I lean, and I've told you where my certainty runs out. The rest belongs to you, because that's how we do it on this channel. I lay out the evidence and the counter-evidence as fairly and as honestly as I know how, and then I trust you to be the adult in the room and make up your own mind. So make it up. And then tell me, straight down there in the comments, which way you actually lean. Do you think the newspaper man stole a native memory and painted it Egyptian, the way I suspect he did? Or do you think, when you strip everything else away, that the oldest voice in this story might simply have been telling the truth the longest? There's no wrong answer tonight. I just want to know how it sits with you, and why. I read them. I really do. And if this was worth the time you gave it, if it put a new thought in your head, or made the hair on your arms stand up even once, do one small thing before you go. Subscribe, and give this video a like. It's a quiet little signal that tells me people still want the careful version of these stories, the one that respects the mystery and the facts at the same time, and it's the thing that lets me keep going down into these forgotten corners of history and hauling them back up into the light for you. That's genuinely all it takes to keep this channel alive. I've got another one waiting for you already, and if tonight got under your skin, that one goes deeper still. It's sitting right there on the screen. Go find out what else we've forgotten. The canyon kept its secret in plain sight for 100 years, and the people who knew the truth were never the ones doing the hiding. The past isn't finished with us yet, not by a long way, so keep your minds open, and until we meet again,